A crow lands on a fence post at the edge of a field. Around it, 40 others gather in silence. No one moves. No one calls out. The crow in the center shifts its weight from foot to foot, and the ring tightens. What follows looks, to any honest observer, less like animal behavior and less like instinct, and more like something we recognize from our own darkest institutions of reckoning. For centuries, people who worked the land watched this happen and had no framework for it. They called them devil's parliaments. They called them witch gatherings. In parts of rural England and Scotland, farmers would stop their work entirely when a crow court assembled in a nearby field, convinced that something of spiritual consequence was unfolding. They were not entirely wrong. They simply lacked the vocabulary. The vocabulary would take centuries more to arrive, and when it did, it arrived not through theology but through ethology, the science of animal behavior, and it appended everything comfortable that we believed about the line between human justice and animal chaos. Crows belong to the family Corvidae, a lineage that has been refining its intelligence for tens of millions of years. The family includes ravens, jackdaws, rooks, magpies, and jays, but the crow sits at a peculiar intersection of social complexity and cognitive firepower. Their brains, relative to body size, rival those of great apes. The prefrontal cortex, that forward-thinking, consequence-weighing region that we associate with everything civilized about human judgment, has a functional analog in the crow's palum, the dense neural architecture beneath the smooth surface of their skulls. They do not have the layered cortical structure we do, but they have arrived, through entirely different evolutionary roads, at many of the same destinations. They remember faces. Not vaguely, not roughly, they remember with the specificity of grudge. Researchers at the University of Washington conducted a series of experiments in which they wore particular masks while trapping crows for banding, and then wore those same masks while walking through campus years later. The crows that had been trapped, and the offspring of those crows who had never been directly harmed, dive-bombed the masked researchers with targeted aggression, scolding them in a din that drew others into the confrontation. The knowledge of who had done wrong had passed between generations. That is not instinct. That is culture. And culture requires something that pure biology does not. It requires transmission, evaluation, and enforcement. When you have those three things, you have the skeleton of justice. The crow court, as field researchers have come to call it, follows a pattern consistent enough across continents and species populations that it cannot be dismissed as coincidence or projection. A crow that has violated something, and we will spend considerable time unpacking what that something is separated from the group, surrounded, and subjected to a period of intense vocalization and display. The surrounding birds call in a specific register distinct from alarm calls and distinct from territorial calls. It is a register that has been described by researchers as deliberate, almost procedural. The accused crow either submits, holds still, shows deference, or it attempts to flee. If it flees, the court pursues. If it submits, the court decides. And sometimes, the decision is death. Not every crow court ends in execution. Most do not. The majority end in some form of social exile, a period in which the offending bird is excluded from communal roosts, denied access to shared food caches, refused grooming, and subjected to ongoing harassment whenever it attempts to reintegrate. Exile in a corporate social structure is not a mild inconvenience. It is a slow sentence. Crows that roost alone are statistically far more likely to be taken by predators. Crows that cache food alone are more likely to lose those caches to theft. Crows that cannot access the collective warning system of the flock miss early alerts about approaching danger. Exile is, by design or by consequence, a punishment calibrated to the social stakes involved. But what triggers it? The question took researchers a long time to answer with any rigor because the behaviors in question are subtle, embedded in a social context that takes years to read correctly. Early observers noted that crow courts seemed to follow the deaths of other crows. Corvids are well documented as gathering around dead members of their species, in behavior that has been called, probably too romantically, crow funerals. But the court is distinct from the funeral gathering. In the funeral, the birds appear to be acquiring information, studying the body, assessing the cause of death, building a shared understanding of the threat that killed the individual. This has been confirmed experimentally, and it is remarkable in its own right. They are essentially conducting a post-mortem to update the group's hazard map. The court is something else entirely. The courts appear to be triggered most reliably by three categories of transgression. The first is theft, specifically the theft of cached food from another crow who is a member of the same social group. The second is deception, and here the story becomes genuinely vertiginous, specifically deception during the caching process itself. The third is what researchers have cautiously described as betrayal of collective defense, meaning the abandonment of a group confrontation against a predator at a critical moment. Each of these deserves its full weight. Crows cache food obsessively. They are hoarders by nature and by necessity, and they have developed extraordinary spatial memory to relocate thousands of individual caches spread across wide territories. But they are also deeply aware that other crows cache food, and they are deeply motivated to steal it. The arms race between caching and theft has produced one of the most sophisticated deception behaviors documented in the animal kingdom. A crow that knows it is being watched while caching will pretend to cache, will go through the full motor sequence of burying food while actually palming it and relocating it to a second, unobserved location. They have been documented doing this repeatedly, waiting until the observer has moved away before making the real cache. This behavior requires the crow to model the mental state of the watcher to understand that the watcher believes the false cache is real, and to maintain that false belief by performing convincingly. This is theory of mind. It is the cognitive capacity that underlies most of what we consider sophisticated social behavior, including the detection of cheaters. And crows detect cheaters with extraordinary accuracy. When a crow that has previously been caught stealing attempts to cache food in its own territory, it becomes paranoid in a way that is almost painful to watch. It checks over its shoulder repeatedly. It creates multiple false caches before committing to a real one. It appears to understand, based on its own behavior as a thief, that it cannot be trusted, and by extension, that others like it cannot be trusted either. Researchers describe this as an attribution of guilt by projection, and while the language remains contested, the behavior itself is consistent and reproducible. When one crow is observed by members of its social group stealing from another group member's cache, not from a stranger, but from a known associate, the response from the group is swift and organized. The thief is singled out. The vocalizations begin. The circle forms. What happens next is where the court earns its name. There is a period of what appears to be testimony. The crow that was robbed vocalizes at length toward the group. Other crows that witness the theft vocalize in shorter bursts, apparently corroborating. The thief, surrounded, is silent or nearly so. In documented cases, researchers have noted that the thief frequently performs appeasement displays during this phase, lowering its head, folding its wings partially, pulling its feathers close to its body, making itself small. These displays are recognized by the surrounding crows, and they appear to factor into what follows. A thief that shows significant appeasement is more likely to receive the lesser sentence of temporary exile. A thief that responds with aggression or attempted flight tends to receive harsher outcomes. That is calibration. That is proportionality. Two of the foundational principles of any functioning justice system. The deception cases are, in some respects, even more striking because they require the group to detect a crime that is, by definition, constructed to be invisible. A crow that has deceived its group members about the location of a food cache has not visibly harmed them in the way a direct thief has, but it has created an informational asymmetry that advantages the deceiver at the group's expense. What is remarkable is that crows notice this asymmetry. Not always, not with perfect reliability, but with a frequency that exceeds chance. They have been observed confronting group members after discovering empty false caches, and the confrontations share the procedural structure of the theft courts. This suggests that the crow's social contract extends beyond the physical into the informational. That deception itself, the manipulation of another's beliefs for personal gain, is recognized as a violation worthy of collective response. This is a moral position. Not necessarily a conscious one, not necessarily a reasoned one in the way we experience reasoning, but functionally and operationally moral. The third category of court-triggering behavior, the abandonment of collective defense, is the most dramatic and the rarest. Crows mob predators. It is one of their most recognizable behaviors. A hawk or an owl that wanders into crow territory is immediately beset by a screaming, diving cloud of black shapes that harass it without mercy until it moves on. This mobbing behavior is cooperative and requires individual crows to accept personal risk for collective benefit. A crow that joins the mob and then peels away at the crucial moment when the predator turns to fight back has used the group's commitment while withdrawing its own. When this is witnessed by other members of the mob, courts have been observed forming afterward, with the apparent coward at the center. The analogy to military desertion is not a comfortable one to sit with. But the structure is nearly identical, and it points towards something that researchers have been arguing about with increasing urgency over the past 2 decades, that the roots of justice, the cognitive and social machinery that produces it, did not originate with human language or human law or human philosophy. It originated in the ancient problem of cooperation, in the challenge faced by any social species that must balance individual self-interest against collective survival. Crows solved this problem, or rather, evolution drove them toward a solution, long before the first human court convened under the first human sky. John Marsleff, one of the most respected corvid researchers working today, has spent decades documenting crows' social behavior in the Pacific Northwest, and his observations have been consistent on one point that cuts against romantic interpretations of crow courts. They are not kind. They are not restorative in any progressive sense. They are enforcement mechanisms, and enforcement mechanisms exist to protect the interests of the majority at the cost of the individual. The crow that is sentenced to exile does not return to the group reformed and welcomed back. The social wound persists. The reintegration, if it happens at all, happens slowly and partially, with the former exile occupying a lower social position than before. There is rank in crow society. Dominance hierarchies exist, and are maintained through ongoing contest and coalition. The courts interact with these hierarchies in ways that are still being mapped. High-ranking crows that commit transgressions face different, often lighter consequences than low-ranking crows that commit the same acts. This has been documented repeatedly, and is consistent enough to be considered a structural feature rather than an anomaly. Power protects in crow society just as it does in ours. The powerful thief and the powerless thief do not receive the same verdict. The court is not blind. That uncomfortable fact deserves to be held rather than explained away. There is a species of rook, the Eurasian rook, which is closely related to the crow, that has been studied extensively in this context because rooks live in large, stable colonies where the same individuals interact over many years. The long-term nature of rook social relationships makes their justice behaviors more visible, because consequences play out slowly across seasons rather than in single dramatic confrontations. In rook colonies, individuals that repeatedly violate social norms, particularly around nest-building theft, which is a significant source of conflict, are tracked by their community over years. Their violations accumulate into social reputations. Other colony members that have no direct experience of a specific theft will nonetheless treat a known thief with heightened suspicion, sharing shorter tolerance windows and refusing coalition assistance. The reputation is the punishment. The reputation follows the individual across seasons, through breeding cycles, through the slow turn of years. Reputation as justice is one of the oldest mechanisms our own species ever used. Before courts, before law, before writing, there was gossip, the transmission of information about who had cheated, who had stolen, who had fled when they should have stood. The rook colony is not a primitive sketch of human justice. It is a parallel solution to the same mathematical problem. The mathematical problem is this: cooperation produces outcomes that benefit all, but it is always individually rational to defect. Without enforcement, cooperation collapses into exploitation, and the group dissolves. Any social species that has survived long-term cooperation has had to solve this problem or go extinct. The solutions converge not because of common ancestry, but because the problem has only a limited number of viable answers. You can enforce through dominance alone, which works until the dominant individual is gone. You can enforce through reputation, which works but requires memory and communication. Or you can enforce through collective action through courts, which works best but requires the most sophisticated cognitive infrastructure of all. Corvids chose, or were shaped toward, all three in combination. And the result looks, to a startling degree, like justice. There is a critical distinction that must be made here, because the story is remarkable enough without embellishment. Crow courts are not the product of deliberate moral reasoning. The crows are not debating the ethics of theft. They are not applying a philosophical framework. What they are doing is following deep behavioral rules that have been shaped over immense spans of time, because groups that enforced those rules survived, and groups that did not enforce them collapsed. The justice is real in its effects and its structure, but it emerges from selection pressure rather than from intention. This is not a diminishment. It is, in some ways, more terrifying, because it means that justice, the framework we have built entire civilizations upon, the principle we have inscribed in stone and argued about for thousands of years, is not a uniquely human invention. It is a biological inevitability. Wherever intelligence and social living combine beyond a certain threshold, justice appears. Not because creatures choose it, but because without it, they die. Researchers studying corvid cognition have increasingly focused on what they call the audience effect, the influence of being watched on the behavior of crows. Crows behave differently when they know they are observed. They are more likely to follow social rules, less likely to attempt theft, more likely to perform generous or cooperative behaviors when they have an audience of group members. Remove the audience, and rates of rule violation increase. This is not moral behavior in the human sense, but it is the structural precondition for moral behavior. It is the sensitivity to social judgment that makes reputation meaningful and courts possible. Humans under observation also behave better. Even paintings of eyes on a wall, studies have shown, reduce petty theft and littering. The cognitive architecture behind the audience effect appears to be ancient and widely distributed. Crows, humans, and several other species of high social intelligence all share it. We are not unique in our sensitivity to judgment. We are simply more elaborate in the systems we have built to exploit it. The raven, which sits just above the crow on every measurable scale of corvid intelligence, takes these tendencies further in ways that make field researchers genuinely uncertain about where description ends and interpretation begins. Ravens form long-term pair bonds and also complex alliance networks, and they actively intervene in the conflicts of their allies. A raven that witnesses a group member being treated unjustly, specifically being targeted by a larger, more dominant bird without apparent provocation, will recruit other ravens to confront the aggressor. They do not simply observe. They intervene on behalf of a third party, at personal cost, on the basis of what appears to be something very like a sense of fairness. The sense of fairness. Researchers use that phrase with deliberate caution. But the Capuchin monkey studies that first brought fairness into the animal cognition debate showed that primates will reject an unequal reward, refuse a grape, when they see their neighbor receiving a better grape for the same work, even at the cost of going without. Subsequent studies expanded this finding across multiple species. And crows, ravens, and their relatives are among the animals that exhibit token rejection behavior under conditions of perceived inequity. They are not indifferent to what others receive. They track it, they compare it, and they respond to imbalance. An animal that tracks inequity and responds to imbalance has the core ingredient for a sense of injustice. And an animal with a sense of injustice will, given sufficient social infrastructure, build a court. The winter roosts of crows are where the courts most often occur, and where the social dynamics of crow justice reach their most concentrated expression. In the deepest winter months, thousands of crows may gather in a single roost, drawn together by the safety of numbers, and by the thermodynamic advantage of shared body heat. These roosts are not random aggregations. They have internal structure, with core positions occupied by high-ranking birds and peripheral positions forced on the low-ranking and the newly arrived. The roost is also an information exchange crows that found productive foraging sites share, through the mechanism of being followed in the morning, information about food locations. The roost is a community with resources, hierarchies, and stakes. In this context, the crow court is not an aberration. It is the roost maintaining itself. It is the community processing the violations that threaten its coherence and responding with the tools that coherence has provided. The tools look like law because they function like law. They set precedents. They communicate consequences. They protect the majority's investment in cooperation by making defection costly. There is a haunting case reported by researchers in Japan, where urban crow populations have grown dense enough and studied long enough that individual birds can be tracked across years. A crow in the Kyoto study area was documented over the course of several winters, as repeatedly stealing from the caches of a specific other crow, a lower-ranking bird that had no effective recourse against the dominant thief. For 2 winters, the theft continued without apparent collective consequence. In the 3rd winter, something shifted. A coalition of mid-ranking crows that had themselves been subject to the thief's dominance began consistently associating with the lower-ranking victim. They followed the thief. They sounded alarm calls in its presence without apparent threat. They blocked its access to preferred roost positions. The thief's dominance ranking declined measurably over the course of that winter. By spring, it had lost priority access to the sites it had monopolized for years. The coalition had enforced what individual vulnerability could not. The group had acted where the victim could not act alone. The outcome was a redistribution of the thief's accumulated advantages. Read that paragraph again slowly. Then consider what institution it describes. Human observers in the field, researchers who spend years with specific crow populations and come to know individuals, report a consistent phenomenon that is difficult to categorize cleanly. The presence of a court, even for those observers who are deeply committed to rigorous, unsentimental science, produces a visceral recognition, not a projection, or not only a projection, but something closer to confrontation. The confrontation with the possibility that the qualities we most prize as distinctly human, the capacity to judge, to enforce, to balance individual and collective, to remember wrongs and make them publicly consequential, are not distinctly human at all. They are corbid qualities too. They may be the qualities of any mind complex enough and social enough to need them. A crow that is expelled from its roost in January, in a northern winter, faces nights of extraordinary cold alone. It faces days of foraging without the intelligence network of the flock. It faces the hawks and the foxes with no early warning and no reinforcements. The expulsion is not a bureaucratic procedure. It is a direct encounter with mortality. The crow that the court sentences to exile is being told, in the only language that evolution understands, that the group's survival matters more than the individual's comfort. Every justice system in human history has made the same statement. The crow stands in the field, in the center of the ring, and the birds around it call and call. We can see this from a distance and tell ourselves it is instinct, it is chemistry, it is the blind firing of neurons shaped by selection. We can say it is not justice because the birds do not know the word. But the crow in the center knows the circle. It knows the sound. It knows what the tightening means. It is waiting for the verdict. And the verdict, when it comes, will be enforced not by a guard, not by a written sentence, not by a judge in a high seat, but by every crow in the roost, consistently, across the long weeks of winter, as the exile calls from the cold edge of the field and no one answers. The machinery of judgment does not require consciousness to run. It requires only stakes high enough and memory long enough and a group willing to pay the cost of enforcement. Somewhere in the dark, recursive problem of what justice actually is not what we say it is, not what we idealize it to be, but what it does, how it functions, what it protects, and what it destroys. Somewhere in that problem, the crow has been sitting longer than we have. Watching, remembering, waiting for the moment when the circle needs to form again.